This is it! The ultimate dimension for rest and stories, and it's called Sleepy Myths.
The first time Rick noticed it, he didn't believe his own senses. Portals by design screamed. They crackled, roared, hissed with neon defiance, splitting through the quiet of a room like a blade through still water. They were never subtle, never soft. They tore, they fractured. They forced their way into existence, but this one whispered. It wasn't even green, not fully. Its surface pulsed with a muted glow, as if it had taken a long breath and decided not to exhale. The circle shimmered like a candle seen through glass. Instead of thunder, it hummed, low, steady, like a lullaby played for no one in particular. Rick leaned closer, squinting. His hands didn't shake, but his thoughts did. It was such a small thing, that difference in tone, yet it unsettled him more than any multiversal anomaly he'd ever charted. A portal wasn't supposed to hum. And yet here it was, purring gently, almost inviting him. Morty stood behind him, fidgeting. Rick? Are you gonna step into it or what? Rick didn't answer at first. He just stared, brow furrowed, lips pressed into the ghost of a line. For all his bluster, Rick was not immune to awe. He would never admit it outright, not even to Morty, but moments like this carved little stillnesses into him, the way rivers cut valleys over centuries. It's different, Rick finally said, almost to himself. His voice was quieter than usual, carrying none of his trademark bite. It's not trying to tear space open. It's asking, Morty tilted his head. Asking what? Rick shrugged, as though the word itself was too fragile to pin down. Instead of replying, he crouched by the glowing edge, listening. The hum vibrated against his ribs like a faint second heartbeat. The sound wasn't random. It was patterned, gentle. It reminded him of nights long ago, when the world was quiet enough that you could hear the refrigerator humming through the walls, or the soft click of his daughter's breathing as she drifted off in another room. For a long moment, Rick didn't move. He just let himself be carried by the strangeness of it. Morty shuffled uncomfortably. It's kind of creepy, Rick. No, Rick said softly, shaking his head. Not creepy, different. He straightened and pocketed his flask without taking a swig. That alone told Morty something had shifted. There was no urgency in the room. No alarms blaring, no explosions pending. Just the steady thrum of a doorway that seemed to be less about traveling and more about listening. And in that stillness, Rick felt a weight loosen in his chest, like a knot untangling without his permission. He reached out his hand, and for the first time in years, he hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. His fingertips brushed the surface of the glow. Instead of resistance, he felt warmth, like pressing his palm against the side of a sleeping animal. The hum deepened slightly, as though the portal were aware of his touch. Morty stepped closer, his eyes wide. Rick, what if it's alive? Rick smirked faintly, but it wasn't his usual mocking grin. So that it's the first damn portal to ever sing instead of scream. He let his hand linger there, resting in the warmth. And though he'd never say it aloud, a strange thought unfurled inside him. Maybe not everything he built had to break. Maybe not every invention had to bite. The hum deepened again, almost like it was responding. And for just a moment, Rick thought he could hear words in it. Indistinct, yes, but familiar, like an echo of a lullaby he had once known and forgotten. Something about stars, something about home. He closed his eyes. For an instant, he wasn't a scientist or a renegade or a grandfather dragging a boy across the cosmos. He was simply a man, listening to a doorway that sounded like it cared. Morty tugged on his sleeve gently. Are we going in? Rick opened his eyes, staring into the soft glow. He almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A portal that didn't demand entry but invited it. He didn't answer Morty right away, because he knew this wasn't a question of logic. It was a question of timing. Some doors you storm through. Others you wait at, letting them decide when you're ready. Finally, he murmured, Not tonight, Morty blinked. Not tonight? Rick, you never wait for anything. Exactly, Rick said quietly. Which is why this one deserves it. The boy didn't understand. Not fully. But he felt the shift, and that was enough. The portal hummed on, low and steady, like a secret the universe wasn't ready to share. Rick turned away, hands deep in his lab coat pockets, his silhouette drawn longer than usual by the glow behind him. Morty followed, still glancing back, as though afraid the portal might vanish while they weren't looking. It didn't. It remained, steady, whispering. A promise, and though Rick would bury the thought beneath sarcasm by morning, he knew something had changed. The multiverse was wide and wild, but tonight, for once, it wasn't screaming at him. It was singing softly, patiently, like it knew he needed it, and somewhere inside, a piece of him whispered back, when they finally stepped through, the world on the other side greeted them not with noise, but with silence so complete it felt alive. Rick had expected the usual, a rush of disorienting air, a blast of color, the sensation of every molecule being reassembled in a hurry. But here, stepping out of the whispering portal was like slipping beneath warm water. His boots touched ground that was solid, yet oddly soft, as though the soil itself had agreed not to resist too much. Morty stumbled a little, then froze, his mouth half open. "Rick, it's so quiet." It was true. There was no wind, no birds, not even the faint hum of distant machines. The air itself seemed to wait, as though the entire planet was holding its breath, and yet it wasn't oppressive. It wasn't the dead silence of a tomb. It was gentler, softer, like the pause between a lullaby's verses. Rick inhaled slowly. The air tasted faintly of something sweet, almost floral, though no flowers grew nearby. Above them, the sky shimmered in layers of color, but not the violent hues of an unstable dimension. These were muted shades, lavender, pale gold, soft gray blue, shifting so gradually they seemed eternal. Morty rubbed his arms. "I feel weird, like I'm moving slow." Rick tested it by lifting his hand. The motion was smooth, but it carried a weight to it, as if time here had stretched itself thin. His wristwatch ticked once every 3 heartbeats. The second hand stuttered, then lingered before it dared to move again. "Time's dragging," Rick murmured. His voice sounded different, stretched out by the air. "Whole planet's in slow motion." Morty turned in a circle, his eyes wide. In the distance, he saw trees with crystal-like branches, each one leaning as if frozen mid-bow. A river glimmered nearby, moving so sluggishly its ripples looked like glass sculptures. Even his own breath lingered before dissolving. "Do you think," Morty whispered, though he didn't know why he whispered, "that it's supposed to be like this? Or is it, broken?" Rick crouched, running his hand across the soil. It was warm, vibrating faintly under his palm, as though it carried a heartbeat older than the universe itself. "Not broken," he muttered, "just different. Not every place is meant to run at our pace." He sat down, cross-legged, which surprised Morty almost as much as the strange planet. Rick never sat down without complaint, but here the weight of time invited stillness, not motion. Morty lowered himself beside him. The ground cradled them gently, and even Morty, so used to panic in alien places, felt no urgency here. It was as though the world itself reassured him. There is no need to rush. For a while they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Morty noticed his thoughts slowing too. Usually his mind raced in anxious loops whenever they traveled, questions piling on top of worries. But here the questions came softly, one at a time, like leaves falling from a high branch. Finally he asked, "Rick, do you think this planet dreams?" Rick didn't scoff. He didn't roll his eyes. He just stared out at the horizon where 2 suns, one pale and one dim, hung motionless, caught in an endless near setting. "If it does," he said softly, "it dreams slow enough to remember." The boy let the words sink in. He didn't always understand Rick's answers, but he felt them, and sometimes that was more important. They walked eventually, their footsteps careful against the glassy soil. Each step echoed faintly as if the planet was listening. Morty bent down to touch the slow-moving river. His fingers sank through water that held him a second longer than expected, then released with reluctance. He laughed quietly at the sensation. "It doesn't want to let go." Rick crouched beside him, dipping his flask into the glowing current. The liquid shimmered, taking minutes to fill the small container. He capped it and tucked it away without explanation. But Morty saw the far-off look in his eyes, the look Rick had whenever he discovered something beautiful he couldn't categorize. As they wandered, they passed fields of crystal reeds, frozen in a breeze that had ended ages ago. Some of the stalks bent gently, forever locked in mid-sway. Morty reached out and brushed one. It chimed faintly, a sound so soft it seemed to fade before it was truly born. The chime repeated, slowly spreading across the field like a ripple. Each reed answered in turn, a chain of delicate notes that rang into the still air. Morty gasped. It's music." Rick tilted his head, listening. The sound wasn't hurried or loud. It was patient, as though the planet itself was composing a song one note at a time, stretched across hours, maybe centuries. Morty lay down among the reeds, staring at the lavender sky. The music lulled him, each note a thread weaving sleep into his body. Rick stood over him for a while, hands in his coat pockets, before finally lowering himself to the ground as well. For once, Rick didn't feel the need to solve, to break, to control. He simply listened. The silence of the planet wasn't empty. It was full of something older than thought, something that spoke without words. He closed his eyes, hearing not only the soft chimes of crystal reeds, but also something deeper, hidden in the slowness, his own heart beating unhurried, Morty's breathing steady, the world humming beneath them, asking nothing except that they stay a while. Rick almost smiled. Almost. And though they would leave eventually, because Rick always left, something about the planet would follow them. Its slowness, its patience, its reminder that sometimes silence isn't absence but presence. Morty shifted beside him, whispering, "I kinda like it here." Rick's voice was so soft Morty almost didn't hear. "Me too, Morty." The suns didn't set. The river didn't rush. The reeds sang on. And for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, Rick let the silence hold him. Morty had always thought of Rick as ancient, untouchable, the kind of man who had been old forever. But sometimes, in rare, unguarded moments, Morty caught glimpses of something else, a flicker, a trace that reminded him Rick had once been a child too. It wasn't in the things Rick said. Words were armor for him, sharp and deflecting. It was in the silences, in the way his eyes softened at certain corners of the universe, in how he lingered longer than necessary when they passed by the laughter of children on distant worlds. One evening, after returning from the still planet, Morty asked softly, "What were you like, when you were my age?" Rick didn't answer right away. He only poured himself a glass of something pale and sat with his shoulders hunched, as though the question had tugged him somewhere far away. Finally he muttered, "Not much different than you, smaller, quieter, maybe a little less scared. Maybe a little more." Morty didn't press, but later that night, as he drifted toward sleep, he imagined Rick as a boy. He saw him sitting alone on the edge of a roof, knees tucked under his chin, staring at stars that flickered behind smog. He wasn't laughing, wasn't cursing, wasn't filling silence with arrogance. He was simply watching, as if the universe might one day answer him back. In Morty's mind, the boy Rick had pockets full of odd trinkets, broken toy parts, wires bent into strange shapes, scraps of glass that caught the light. Things other kids threw away he kept, not because they were useful, but because they whispered possibilities. Rick, even as a child, noticed what others ignored. He noticed when his mother's hands trembled pouring coffee. He noticed the way his father's sighs carried more weight than words. He noticed the faint flicker of a dying streetlight and wondered how it might be coaxed to glow again. He noticed, too, the loneliness of things. Stray dogs, forgotten playgrounds, the dust gathering on windowsills. No one looked through anymore. Morty imagined him walking slowly home at dusk, tracing shapes in the air with a stick, pretending he was opening doors to other worlds. Not out of arrogance or ambition, but out of quiet yearning. A way to soften the edges of his own smallness. And though Morty couldn't know the exact truth, some part of it was real. Rick's childhood was stitched into him in ways he never admitted. The sharpness of his adulthood was a mask, forged in part to hide the tenderness he once carried openly. There were times Rick remembered, too. Shadows of it came to him in dreams. The smell of oil and rain on the same night. The taste of cold sandwiches eaten in silence. The sound of a lullaby sung off-key by a voice that faded from memory too soon. Those memories pressed on him whenever Morty looked at him with wide, questioning eyes. Because Rick had once looked at the world the same way, afraid, hopeful, endlessly searching. Morty sensed it one morning when Rick set a plate of food in front of him without a word. The eggs were uneven, the toast burnt on one side, but it was food prepared with the same absent-minded care of someone who used to watch his mother cook in half-light kitchens. Morty didn't comment. He just ate, and Rick drank quietly, and between them there was an unspoken thread. Another time, Morty noticed how Rick's hand hovered a moment too long over an old family photograph tucked into the corner of his desk. The picture wasn't of Morty's family. It was older, sepia-toned, blurred with age. A young boy with curious eyes stood there, stiff in a shirt too big for him. Rick never explained who he was looking at, and Morty didn't ask, yet something in that silence told him everything. Rick carried shadows, not just of mistakes, but of tenderness. Small kindnesses no one had seen, moments when he had wanted to hold on instead of run, and though Morty couldn't change the past, he could feel it in the present. Every time Rick hesitated, every time his voice softened for just a second before hardening again. That night, Morty dreamt of a young Rick again. In the dream, the boy built a small machine out of bottle caps and string. It didn't do much, just spun in the wind, catching bits of sunlight. But the boy smiled at it, proud, as if he'd created a whole new world. Morty woke with the image still in his chest, heavy and warm. At breakfast, he looked at Rick, really looked at him. "You're different than you act, Rick. You always have been." Rick froze mid-sip of his drink, then scowled in mock irritation. "Don't get sentimental, Morty, that's my job." But his voice trembled just slightly at the edges. The day moved on as days always did, full of portals and mishaps. Yet something in their rhythm had shifted. Morty carried the memory of the boy Rick with him, and Rick, though he would never admit it, carried the weight of being seen. Childhood shadows don't disappear. They stretch, they follow, they remind, and sometimes under the right light they soften. That evening Morty caught Rick staring out a window, lost in thought. For once Morty didn't interrupt. He just sat beside him in silence, and in that shared quiet, both of them felt the echoes of a boy who had once looked at the stars and wondered if they would ever look back. Rick was not known for restraint. His inventions almost always burned with urgency. Loud, chaotic, reckless, torn from the fabric of the universe by hands that didn't have patience for hesitation. Most of his devices were made to disrupt, to slice, to bend reality under the pressure of his brilliance. But one evening, something shifted. Perhaps it was the lingering memory of the whispering portal. Perhaps it was the silence of the still planet still echoing in him. Or perhaps it was simply a quiet corner of his mind that he rarely allowed to breathe. Whatever the reason, Rick sat at his workbench not to destroy but to listen. The garage was dim, cluttered as always, but unusually still. Even the tools seemed subdued, their metal edges catching the faintest light. Rick moved slowly, carefully, setting wires in place as if not to disturb the quiet. Morty leaned against the doorway watching. "What's that one gonna do, Rick? Is it dangerous?" Rick didn't look up. Not dangerous. Not useful either. Maybe not even anything. His voice was flat but softer than usual, like an old blanket left in sunlight. "Just different." Morty shuffled closer, curiosity outweighing his caution. Different how? Rick twisted two thin coils together, his fingers unusually steady. "It's not going to blast holes in anything. Not going to zap or burn or rip reality in half. It's just gonna listen." Morty frowned. "Listen like to what?" Rick paused. He didn't answer right away, as though the question itself required silence before a reply. Finally, he said, "To what's been forgotten. To what's still here even if nobody notices." The device took shape slowly, a circular frame delicate as a bird's ribcage, lined with fragments of glass no bigger than teardrops. Wires ran like veins, glowing faintly with an energy Morty couldn't name. It didn't hum, didn't crackle. It simply sat there, holding its breath. When Rick touched a switch, the glass fragments shimmered, each one flickering with faint images. Not sharp memories, but impressions. Colors, sounds, shadows of laughter, too old to place. Morty gasped. "Is that people?" Rick's eyes narrowed. "Not people, echoes. Every world keeps them. Things left behind. Moments that mattered enough to cling to the air. One shard flickered with the image of a child chasing a kite across a field that no longer existed. Another hummed faintly with the notes of a lullaby sung in a language Morty didn't recognize. One showed the shadow of a hand, reaching but never quite touching. Morty leaned in, mesmerized. "It's beautiful." Rick didn't answer. His face was unreadable, but his grip on the edge of the device was tight, almost trembling. He didn't look at Morty. He looked at the fragments as though they knew him. Morty pointed to one shard glowing pale blue. What's that one? Rick's throat worked as if he wanted to swallow words. The shard showed a blurred kitchen, a woman humming softly as she stirred something on a stove. A child's laughter echoed faintly, though no figures were visible. Rick turned the device off abruptly. The shards went dark, their light swallowed into silence. Morty looked at him, puzzled. "Why'd you stop it?" Rick exhaled long and low. "Because it's not for staring. It's not a damn TV, it's a reminder. Some things are better left soft," Morty frowned. "Soft." Rick finally met his gaze, and for once his eyes weren't sharp. They were tired, yes, but also vulnerable in a way Morty rarely saw. "Yeah, Morty, soft. Not everything's supposed to be broken open. Sometimes it's enough to know it's there." The garage grew quiet again. Morty sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. He didn't speak, and Rick didn't chase him off. They both stared at the now dark device, its frame still warm with the memory of echoes. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Time blurred in the dim light. Eventually, Morty asked, almost in a whisper, "Do you think the universe keeps all of it? Every laugh? Every goodbye?" Rick leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the ceiling. "Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't matter. What matters is, we feel like it does. That's enough." He reached for his flask, then stopped halfway, setting it back down. Instead, he tapped the edge of the device once gently, like a man patting the shoulder of an old friend. Morty smiled faintly. He didn't understand it all. Not the science, not the weight behind Rick's silence, but he understood enough. Rick wasn't always building to run away. Sometimes he was building to remember. Later that night, after Morty had gone to bed, Rick returned to the device. He switched it on again, just for a moment. He didn't record, didn't analyze. He simply watched as one shard flickered to life, showing nothing more than the faint outline of stars framed by a child's window. Rick sat in the dark, watching that shard, until the image faded back to silence. And when he finally shut it down, he whispered not to Morty, not to himself, but to the echoes still lingering in the air. "I hear you." The garage returned to silence. But somewhere deep in the circuits of the soft experiment, the echoes waited, patient and unbroken. The night was unusually clear. The stars stretched like threads of silver against the black canvas of the universe. Rick and Morty stepped out of the portal and into air so thin it almost felt like a whisper. Above them, two moons hung side by side, one pale and cracked, the other glowing faintly with a warm golden blush. Their light poured softly over the quiet hills, spilling like milk across the ground. Morty tilted his head back, staring. "Whoa. 2 moons. That's really beautiful, Rick." Rick's usual reply, a sharp quip, a sarcastic brush-off, didn't come. Instead, he stood with his hands in the pockets of his lab coat, gaze fixed upward. For a moment his outline looked smaller, softened by the glow of the twin moons. They walked without urgency, the grass bending under their steps with a sigh, not a crunch. The hills rolled endlessly, silent except for a faint hum in the air. So low Morty thought at first it was in his head. "Rick, you hear that?" Rick didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing, listening. Then quietly he said, "Yeah, not your imagination. The whole planet's humming." The sound was soft, like a lullaby carried by wind. It rose and fell, not words, not melody exactly, just tone, vibration, something woven through the fabric of the place. Morty stopped walking, letting it wash over him. His chest felt lighter, like the sound was gently holding him. "Where's it coming from?" Morty asked. Rick crouched, running his hand over the ground. The soil shimmered faintly under his touch, responding to the moon's glow. "Planet's got a resonance, 2 satellites pulling at it like a cosmic guitar string." His voice was quieter than usual, analytical but touched with awe. They climbed a ridge and found a valley below them. Pools of still water lay scattered like mirrors, reflecting the twin moons in trembling patterns. The hum deepened here, softer, richer, almost like a song waiting to be recognized. Morty sat on the edge of the ridge, dangling his feet. "It feels safe, you know, like it's telling us to rest." Rick sat beside him, not slouched, not restless, but still. He pulled his flask from his pocket but didn't drink. Instead, he tapped it lightly against his knee in time with the faint rhythm of the hum. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The sound filled the silence, threading into their bones. It was the kind of sound that didn't demand attention but invited it, like a mother humming in the next room. Not for you, but near you. Finally, Morty said, "It's like music, like lullabies. My mom used to hum when she thought nobody was listening." His voice wavered, almost embarrassed at sharing. Rick didn't laugh. He didn't mock. He simply nodded, eyes still on the moons. "Yeah, my mom did too." The words slipped out quickly, almost reluctantly, but he didn't pull them back. Morty looked at him in surprise. Rick almost never mentioned his own childhood, as if the past was too fragile to hold. But now, under 2 moons, he let a sliver through. The hum swelled slightly, as if echoing the confession. Morty lay back on the grass, folding his arms under his head. "Feels like the planet's singing us to sleep." Rick didn't lie down, but he did lean back on his hands, letting the hum settle over him. His face, so often sharp and shielded, softened in the lunar glow. His eyes closed briefly, and for a moment he looked less like a man running from everything, and more like someone simply resting. Morty's voice grew slower, drowsier. "Do you think maybe every world's got a song? Like, we just don't stop long enough to hear it?" Rick opened one eye, watching him. A faint smirk tugged at his mouth, not mocking but fond. "Maybe, Morty. Maybe that's the only difference between us and the universe. We never shut up long enough to hear it sing back." The moons shifted slightly in the sky, and the hum changed pitch, softer now, like a cradle rocking. The pools in the valley reflected the change, rippling light across the hills. Morty closed his eyes, his breathing evening out, the sound pulling him closer to sleep. Rick stayed awake longer, his gaze drifting between the moons and the boy beside him. His hand brushed the grass, and for reasons he didn't say aloud, he hummed a low note under his breath, just enough to blend with the planet's resonance. It was not in tune, not perfect, but it was soft. It was enough. When Morty finally slipped into sleep, the hum carried him gently, as if the planet itself had tucked him in. Rick stayed beside him, silent, listening, and though he would never admit it even to himself, Rick felt the weight in his chest ease, not gone. Not healed, but lighter. 2 moons sang above them, and Rick let the sound hold him too, if only for that one quiet night. The morning on the twin-mooned planet lingered longer than expected. When Morty stirred awake, the hum was still there, faint but steady, woven into the wind as though the world itself never tired of singing. Rick was already standing a short distance away, fussing with a device in his hands, the faint glow of green circuitry pulsing in rhythm with the planetary song. Morty rubbed his eyes, then sat up slowly. His chest felt heavy with dreams he couldn't quite recall, but he knew they were gentle ones. Standing, he walked toward Rick, who muttered curses under his breath at the stubborn piece of tech. Rick," Morty began carefully, his voice still thick with sleep. "Why do we always have to fix something or build something or keep moving? Can't we just stay?" Rick didn't look up. "Morty, universes don't wait around. Entropy doesn't take a nap just 'cause you want one." He tightened a wire with an impatient twist, his tone clipped, mechanical. But Morty didn't let the words stop him. He felt something different today, a slowness from the lullaby still holding him. He stepped closer. "I'm serious, Rick. You ever think maybe you don't always have to fight against it? Maybe sometimes the universe wants us to listen. Just be here." The words came out softer than defiance usually does, but their weight landed heavier. Rick finally stopped, lowering the device with a sigh. He looked at Morty, his expression caught between irritation and something else, something quieter. "Morty, do you know what happens when you stop moving? You get caught, stuck. You end up a fossil in someone else's museum." His voice was gruff, but the way he avoided Morty's eyes betrayed something more vulnerable than the words suggested. Morty swallowed. The old fear that Rick would snap at him, dismiss him, belittle him, sat at the edge of his chest. But he kept going. "Maybe being stuck isn't the worst thing. Maybe being stuck means you cared about something enough to stay." Rick flinched almost imperceptibly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the planet and the faint whir of Rick's device cooling. Then Rick let out a laugh, short and brittle. "Since when did you get all philosophical, huh? You reading fortune cookies behind my back?" Morty shook his head, not smiling. Since I realized you're not always right, Rick. You think you have to outrun everything, pain, time, people. But sometimes, I don't want to run. His voice cracked, but not with anger, with care. I don't want you to either. The words hung there, softer than rebellion, but stronger than silence. Morty didn't raise his voice, didn't pound his fists. His defiance was quiet, like a candle flame refusing to be blown out. Rick's face twitched like he might fire back with sarcasm. But instead he looked away, staring at the two moons now sinking low over the valley. You don't know what you're asking for, Morty. Maybe not, Morty admitted. But I know what it feels like right now, and I don't want this moment to end just because you can't sit still. Rick's jaw tightened. His hands fidgeted with the device, then stilled. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he folded it shut and slipped it back into his coat pocket. For the first time in a long while, Rick didn't argue. He sat down in the grass, his knees drawn up, staring at the pools below. Morty sat beside him, relieved but quiet. They didn't need more words. The act itself, the sitting, the waiting, the listening, was Morty's victory. Not over Rick, but with him. A breeze carried the hum across the hills, and for a while they simply breathed together. Rick's shoulders eased, his gaze distant but softer. Morty, Rick said at last, his voice low. You're almost thoughtful. You're still an idiot, but sometimes idiots are the only ones who notice the obvious. Morty smiled faintly. Guess that makes me useful, huh? Rick didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth twitched upward. The closest thing to a smile Morty had seen all week. The moons sank further, and the pools dimmed, their glow fading with the dawn. Still, the hum lingered, quieter now, like the world was whispering goodbye. Morty leaned back in the grass, feeling the warmth of the planet beneath him, and let the silence stretch. Rick stayed beside him, for once unhurried. The device in his pocket stayed untouched. The stars above dimmed into daylight, but neither of them moved. For a little while longer, Morty's gentle defiance became their shared stillness, an unspoken agreement that sometimes running wasn't the answer. Sometimes staying was. The portal opened with a sigh rather than its usual roar, spilling pale green light onto the quiet street of a dimension Morty didn't recognize. The air smelled faintly of smoke and warm bread, the kind of scent that hinted at hearths rather than laboratories. Rick stepped through first, his usual swagger slowed by the silence of the place. Morty followed, blinking at the rows of modest homes with lanterns glowing in their windows. Where are we? Morty asked, his voice hushed as though the street itself demanded reverence. Rick grunted, pulling his coat tighter against the cool breeze. Another dimension, one where things went a little differently. They walked down the street until they reached a house at the edge of the town, its door framed by creeping ivy. Rick knocked once, not with urgency, but with a strange formality. Like he knew the person on the other side, the door opened to reveal another Rick. His hair was whiter, softer. His face lined not just with stress, but with something gentler. He wore no lab coat, just a worn sweater that smelled faintly of wood smoke. This Rick didn't carry the weight of brilliance like a weapon. He carried it like a story he didn't need to tell. Ah, the stranger Rick said, smiling faintly. I thought I heard the hum of a portal. Come in. Morty blinked between the two Ricks, uneasy at the mirror image. But when they entered the house, warmth washed over him. The table was already set for 3, bowls of steaming soup waiting. Lanterns hung in the corners, their light golden and soft, flickering against the wood-paneled walls. They sat without much talk at first. The stranger Rick poured them each a glass of water, his movements unhurried. Morty felt the strangeness of it, the absence of urgency, the presence of care. This is weird? Morty whispered to his Rick, leaning closer. He's like you, but not, Rick muttered. Yeah, don't remind me. But his voice lacked its usual bite. He glanced at his alternate self with something like suspicion mixed with curiosity. The stranger. Rick broke the silence first. I used to live the way you still do. Running, inventing, trying to outwit the universe at every turn. Until one day I realized it wasn't a battle I wanted to win. He stirred his soup gently, not looking at them. So I stayed. Built a garden, cooked dinner, listened when people spoke. Morty sipped his soup, surprised at the flavor. Simple, warm, soothing in a way no invention could replicate. He looked at his Rick, waiting for a sarcastic dismissal. But instead, Rick ate quietly, eyes lowered, his mind clearly turning. The stranger. Rick went on, his tone calm. It doesn't make me less of who I am. Just a different version, one who chose kindness over control. Rick finally lifted his head, his eyes narrowing. You gave up. That's what it sounds like to me, the stranger. Rick met his gaze without flinching. Or maybe I found something worth more than winning. His smile wasn't smug. It was weary but sincere. Morty's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, but the weight between the two Ricks was too heavy for his voice to pierce. Instead, he focused on the soup, letting its warmth steady him. For a long while, the only sound was the clink of spoons against bowls. Outside, the lanterns swayed gently in the wind, their glow seeping through the windows like soft reminders of something beyond. Finally, Morty spoke, his voice quiet but firm. I kind of like this version of you, Rick. He's calmer, nicer. It's not scary to sit here. His Rick shot him a look, but not a harsh one, more like a wounded glance. Careful, Morty. You might hurt my feelings. But the words lacked venom. They sounded almost hollow, like armor that no longer fit. The stranger Rick chuckled lightly. Feelings aren't something to be afraid of, you know. They're just proof that you're alive. Morty nodded slowly, staring at the lantern glow dancing on the table. His Rick didn't respond, but his shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining from his posture. After dinner, the stranger Rick showed them his garden. Lanterns hung above the plants, their soft light keeping the night gentle. He bent down to touch the leaves of a small flower, his hands steady, practiced. This is my invention now, he said softly. Patience. Watching things grow. Morty looked at his Rick, wondering if the words would sink in. Rick's face was unreadable, caught between contempt and longing. When they left, stepping back into the cool street, Morty glanced once more at the glowing windows. He wanted to ask Rick what he thought, but something told him silence was better. Rick lit his portal gun, the green light spilling across the cobblestones. For a moment his hand lingered at his side, as though he might turn back. But then he shook his head, muttered something Morty didn't catch, and stepped forward. Morty followed, the hum of the portal blending with the memory of lanterns and soup, and a stranger Rick who felt more like family than an alternate. The portal closed softly behind them, leaving the town bathed in lantern light, a quiet world content in its stillness. The next portal carried them not into chaos or danger, but into quiet light. When Morty opened his eyes, the first thing he saw were lanterns, thousands of them suspended in the air like fireflies frozen mid-flight. Each glowed faintly, their colors shifting in soft pulses, pale blue, warm amber, rose-tinted gold. They drifted above a vast plain that stretched endlessly, the ground beneath them reflective as glass. Morty gasped, his breath fogging the mirrored ground. Rick, it's like the whole place is lit by floating stars. Rick adjusted his coat, scanning the horizon. Lanterns. Self-sustaining energy nodes. Not natural. Someone left them here. But even his voice carried a softness, as though the world itself had hushed him. They walked forward, their reflections trailing beneath their feet. The lanterns swayed slightly as they passed, not pushed by wind but by some unseen rhythm. Each one seemed alive, glowing brighter when noticed, dimming when ignored. Morty reached out hesitantly, fingers brushing the surface of a lantern that floated at chest height. The glow brightened, and for a split second he heard something. Laughter, faint and childlike, like an echo pulled from memory. Morty stumbled back. Rick, I heard something, like a memory. Rick paused, studying a lantern that drifted close to him. His eyes narrowed. He didn't touch it, but his posture stiffened as if he already knew what Morty meant. These aren't just lights, Morty, they're recordings, imprints. Whoever made this place didn't want data, they wanted remembrance. Morty frowned, his gaze sweeping the glowing expanse. So, each lantern is like someone's moment? Their memory? Rick didn't answer right away. He finally reached out, his hand trembling only slightly, and let his fingertips graze a lantern. His eyes flickered as though he'd seen something too personal to describe. When he pulled his hand back, his jaw clenched tight. Yeah, he muttered. Memories. They kept walking. Lanterns drifted around them, some high, some low, each glowing with its own rhythm. Morty touched another, a soft pink one, and this time heard the sound of someone humming a lullaby. His chest ached at the familiarity, though he couldn't place it. Rick moved quickly now, his steps sharper. He avoided the lanterns, not looking at the ones that drifted near him. Morty noticed but said nothing. Sometimes silence said more than questions. Eventually they came to a clearing where the lanterns formed a slow spiral above their heads, circling as though marking a place of rest. Morty sat down, the glassy ground cool beneath him. Lantern light washed over his face, and for the first time he felt no fear of the dark. "Rick," Morty said softly, "do you think maybe this is what people want to leave behind? Not inventions, not power, just the moments that mattered." Rick gave a sharp exhale, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. People always want to leave something. "Doesn't mean the universe cares." Morty shook his head. "I don't think it's about the universe. I think it's about us. About remembering." He paused, then looked up at Rick, his voice steady. "Do you ever want to be remembered, Rick?" The question hung between them, glowing as brightly as the lanterns. Rick didn't answer. His eyes shifted upward, following the spiral of lights, and for once his silence felt less like avoidance and more like confession. Morty leaned back, letting the glow wash over him. One lantern drifted low, settling near his shoulder. It glowed pale blue, and when Morty touched it, he heard something faint, his own voice, younger, laughing at something Rick had said. A memory he didn't even know he carried. His eyes widened. "Rick, this one's—" "It's me." Rick finally sat down beside him, pulling the flask from his coat but not drinking. He stared at the lantern, his reflection shining faintly in its glow. "Lanterns don't lie, Morty. Whatever's in there, it's real." Morty listened again, the sound soft, like a thread tied back to a forgotten day. His throat tightened, and he let the lantern drift away, rising back into the spiral above. Rick leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "The problem with memory is it never tells the whole story. You hear laughter, but you don't hear what came after. You remember the good, but forget the weight." His voice was low, rough, almost breaking. Morty turned toward him, his tone gentle. "Maybe that's okay. Maybe remembering the good is enough." Rick looked at him, and for a fleeting moment the hardness in his eyes cracked. "Maybe," he whispered. They sat there, bathed in light, lanterns circling like stars caught in slow orbit. The world didn't rush them, didn't demand they move on. It simply held them, as though their presence was enough. Morty eventually lay back, staring at the endless lanterns drifting above. He thought of the stranger Rick from the night before, of soup and lantern gardens, of the lullaby planet, of all the soft places they had stumbled into. He wondered if, somewhere in all the chaos, Rick was beginning to hear what he'd been hearing all along. Rick stayed upright, watching the lights, his face unreadable. But when Morty's breathing slowed into the rhythm of near sleep, Rick let his hand drift outward, brushing a lantern close to him. He didn't speak of what he heard. He only let it linger in his chest for a moment, before releasing it, watching it drift back upward. A glow among thousands, the lantern world sang its silent chorus, and they remained there until the silence became enough, until memory and light were indistinguishable. The lantern world lingered in their bones even after they stepped back through the portal. Morty still saw drifting lights when he closed his eyes, still heard the faint hum of memories. But the next world was quieter, simpler. The portal spat them onto a rolling hill beneath a velvet dusk. The grass here was long and soft, bending under the breeze like waves across an invisible sea. Above, stars were already spilling across the sky, not in scattered constellations, but in wide drifting clusters, like someone had brushed them across the heavens with slow, deliberate strokes. Morty breathed in, filling his lungs with air that smelled faintly of mint and earth. He smiled without meaning to. "It feels nice here, Rick, safe." Rick didn't answer at first. He crouched, rummaging through his coat. When he finally stood, he held 2 pieces of bread, a jar of something Morty didn't recognize, and a block of cheese. Morty blinked. Rick, are you about to make a sandwich?" Rick smirked faintly, the expression more tired than mocking. "What, a guy can't make a sandwich on a hill under a starry sky?" "Thought you liked normal." Morty laughed awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. No, it's just—" "I didn't think you did that kind of thing." Rick sat on the grass, cross-legged, and pulled out a small knife. He began cutting the cheese with slow, precise movements, far calmer than his usual hurried tinkering. The silence between them wasn't heavy this time. It was patient, like the air itself had settled in to watch. Morty lowered himself beside him, leaning back on his hands, staring at the sweep of stars. He felt the weight of time slow, every sound softened by the hush of the grass. Rick spread the cheese, layered the bread, and handed Morty half without a word. Morty took it, staring at it for a moment before biting in. The taste wasn't anything extraordinary. Cheese, bread, a smear of something tangy, but in that moment, it felt like the best thing he'd ever eaten. They ate in silence at first, the stars brightening overhead. Morty finally said, "You ever think maybe this is enough? Just sitting here, eating, watching stars fall." Rick chewed slowly, his eyes fixed upward. A meteor traced a faint silver arc across the sky, dissolving before it reached the horizon. He swallowed, then spoke in a voice softer than usual. "Enough for you, maybe. Enough for me? I don't know if I'd recognize it if I saw it." Morty turned his head, studying him. "But you made the sandwich." Rick gave a small huff of air, almost a laugh. "Yeah, well, maybe I didn't want you passing out from hunger and blaming me for it." But his eyes betrayed him. They lingered on Morty longer than the words admitted. Another meteor streaked by. Then another. Soon the sky was alive with falling stars, soft trails like brushstrokes painting themselves in motion. Morty set his sandwich down on the grass, staring in awe. "Rick, it's like the whole sky's raining." Rick leaned back, resting on his elbows, his face lit faintly by the trails of light. He didn't speak, but his eyes softened, lids half closed, as though he was letting the beauty in despite himself. Morty felt the urge to fill the silence, but resisted. He remembered the stranger Rick's house, the lantern world's glow, the hum of the twin moon planet. Sometimes silence wasn't empty. It was full. After a while, Rick said quietly, "Morty, you ever notice how stars look brighter when you're not running around trying to catch them?" Morty smiled faintly. "Yeah, I guess you have to be still long enough to see 'em fall." Rick nodded, his gaze drifting. His flask was still in his pocket, untouched. Instead, he picked up his half-eaten sandwich and took another slow bite. The sound of chewing seemed almost sacred under the canopy of falling stars. Morty leaned back fully, lying on the grass. He felt the cool earth beneath him, grounding him while the stars seemed to tug at his chest, pulling him upward. His eyelids grew heavy, but he fought sleep for a little while longer. "Thanks, Rick," Morty murmured suddenly. Rick glanced at him. "For what?" Morty hesitated, then shrugged. "For the sandwich." "For sitting here. For not rushing." Rick's face softened, though he masked it with a snort. "Don't get used to it, Morty. Next stop might be a dimension full of carnivorous lawn chairs." Morty chuckled, but his eyes stayed on the stars. "Still, this is nice, like a memory I'd want to keep in one of those lanterns." Rick looked at him for a long time, then tilted his head back toward the sky. His expression was unreadable, but his body language, his stillness, his presence said what he couldn't. The stars fell, the meteors painting the night in streaks of silver and white. Their sandwiches grew cold, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the pause, the shared stillness, the act of being two small figures on a hill beneath a universe too vast to measure. When Morty finally drifted towards sleep, his sandwich still clutched loosely in one hand. Rick reached over and set it gently on the grass. He stayed awake a while longer, watching the stars. And though he would never admit it, even to himself, part of him wished the moment could stretch forever. The stars kept falling. And for that night on that hill it was enough. The hill with its falling stars lingered in Morty's memory like the taste of something simple and perfect, cheese and bread under a cosmic rain. But the next portal didn't open into falling light or gentle grass. It opened into stillness, vast and heavy, where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. They stepped through into a place where time felt different, thicker, slower, like syrup pouring instead of water. The ground was flat and grey, broken only by a single figure seated on a low stone. He wasn't moving. He wasn't tinkering. He wasn't even drinking. He was just waiting. Morty squinted. His heart kicked up. "Gee, Rick, that's you, or another you?" The man turned his head. The face was Rick's, lined, weary, but his eyes were startlingly clear. No flask in sight, no gadgets scattered around him. Just stillness. "Ah," the seated Rick said, his voice deep and calm. "You made it." Rick frowned, scratching his chin. "Made it where? And what's with the monk act? You join a waiting club or something?" The seated Rick smiled faintly. You could say that. I've been waiting here for, well, long enough? Morty glanced nervously between them. Waiting for what? The seated Rick looked at Morty instead of his counterpart. His gaze wasn't sharp like the Rick Morty knew. It was soft, almost kind. Waiting to see if patience could build a different kind of answer. I used to run. Always running, into experiments, into escapes, into bottles. But I stopped, sat down, decided to watch instead. Our Rick huffed, pulling his flask out but not drinking yet. Yeah, sounds real productive. You wait long enough, maybe the universe sends you a medal in the mail. The other Rick chuckled softly. Not a medal. Just moments. The kind you miss when you're always sprinting ahead. Morty shifted closer, curious despite himself. Like, what kind of moments? The seated Rick closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again with a glint that was almost nostalgic. The way grass bends before wind you don't feel yet. The sound of a stone warming under the sun. A laugh that echoes longer than the words around it. Morty blinked. His chest ached a little, though he wasn't sure why. He glanced at his Rick, who looked unimpressed but whose flask still remained capped. Yeah, our Rick muttered. So you turned into a poetic rock collector. You think waiting fixes anything? Newsflash, it doesn't. Things keep breaking whether you move or not. The seated Rick tilted his head, studying him with an expression Morty had rarely seen on Rick's face. Understanding, not judgment. Maybe, but waiting lets you see what doesn't need fixing. What's already whole, even if it's quiet. Morty looked between them, his stomach tight. One Rick restless, sharp edges always exposed. The other Rick softened, worn smooth like stone in water. And somewhere between them Morty felt caught. He whispered almost without realizing, which one's real? Both Ricks turned to him. Neither laughed at the question. The seated Rick finally answered. Both and neither. Every Rick chooses which parts of himself to sharpen, which to dull. I chose patience. Our Rick scoffed, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of thought he didn't voice. He sat on a nearby rock, mirroring his counterpart almost against his will. The silence stretched between them like a third presence. Morty lowered himself into the grass. He could feel time moving slower here, like the whole world was nudging them to breathe more deeply, to speak less, to notice more. At length our Rick muttered, So you just sat here? For years? The seated Rick nodded. I listened. I watched. And I waited. Not for answers, not for miracles. Just for the chance that maybe someone would come along and notice. Morty swallowed. Notice what? Notice that stillness has its own kind of wisdom. His voice was soft now, almost a lullaby. That waiting doesn't mean giving up. It means giving space. For things to unfold. For people to speak. For stars to fall when they're ready. Morty thought of the hill, the sandwiches, the meteors. He thought of Rick sitting silently beside him. And he realized that maybe, just maybe, his Rick already carried a fragment of this waiting inside him. The two Ricks sat across from each other, mirror and reflection, neither moving. The air vibrated faintly, like the hum of a string plucked in some unseen instrument. Morty didn't want to break it, but his eyelids were heavy. Before he drifted, he heard our Rick mutter in a voice rougher than usual. Still don't think I could do it. All that waiting, the seated Rick replied gently. You don't have to do it forever. Just long enough to hear what you've been running past. The silence folded around them again, deep and steady. Morty closed his eyes, sinking into the rhythm of that quiet world. Into the two versions of Rick, who were somehow the same and utterly different. And as he drifted, he thought he understood. Sometimes the universe didn't ask you to run. Sometimes it just asked you to wait. When they left the still world of the waiting Rick, Morty carried with him the strange silence, like an echo pressed against his chest. It clung to him, gentle but heavy, and when he stepped back into the cool air of the next dimension, he noticed how even Rick's footsteps seemed quieter. The portal had deposited them into a dim, cluttered place. Not a planet this time, but a room. Rickety walls, shelves lined with half-finished devices, stacks of dusty books no one had opened in decades. It looked eerily like Rick's garage back home, only older, lonelier. Morty brushed a layer of dust off a table. This feels weird. Like it's your place, but also not. Rick didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the room carefully, wary, like he was walking through his own memories. Then he spotted a box in the corner, worn, taped at the edges, tucked away as if hiding itself from notice. He approached, knelt, and pried it open. Inside were papers, envelopes, letters, some still sealed, some crumpled, all written in a familiar, jagged hand. His hand, Morty leaned over his shoulder. "Are those yours?" Rick held one up. The envelope bore no name, just the words "for no one, for never." He hesitated, then tore it open. The paper inside was yellowed, ink-smudged, words messy but clear enough. He read in silence at first, then his lips began to shape the sentences. "I built another world today, not because I needed it, but because I couldn't stand the one I had. I thought maybe I'd find something different in the corners of infinity, but all I keep finding is myself. And sometimes that's the worst thing to run into." Morty froze. His chest tightened. It wasn't just the words. It was the way Rick's voice softened as he read them, the way his shoulders slumped like the sentences were too heavy to carry. Another letter. "Morty asked me today why I drink so much. I told him the truth, because stopping would mean listening to the silence. And the silence reminds me of everything I've lost. I hope one day he understands not the bottle, but the silence." Morty swallowed hard, his throat aching. "Rick, did you really write all this?" Rick dropped the letter back into the box, his face unreadable. "Another me did. Could have been me. Maybe still is. Maybe will be," he grunted. "Doesn't matter, but it did matter." Morty could feel it. The words pulsed like heartbeats in the room. He pulled another letter from the pile before Rick could stop him. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. The handwriting was the same, messy and rushed, but the tone was different. Softer, almost fragile. "If anyone ever reads this, it means I was too much of a coward to say it out loud. So here it is, I love them, all of them. My daughter, my Morty, even the people I push away. I don't say it because love feels like weakness, like a gap someone else can shoot through. But I feel it anyway, and I hope in some quiet way they know." Morty's eyes blurred. He blinked quickly, not wanting Rick to see the wetness forming there. He folded the paper back almost reverently and set it on the table. "Rick," he whispered, you do care. Even if you don't say it, I mean, you've always cared." Rick didn't meet his gaze. Instead, he fished out another envelope, unopened, and flicked it into the air with a shrug. "These letters, Morty, they're like ghosts. Things we thought but never said. Doesn't make 'em true. Doesn't make 'em false either, just somewhere in between," Morty wanted to argue, but the softness in Rick's tone stopped him. This wasn't denial. It was a kind of confession Rick couldn't frame any other way. They sat together in the dimness, the letters spread out like fragile pieces of a soul. Dust floated lazily in the air, catching the faint glow from a crack in the wall. Morty finally asked, "Why'd he never send them? Why write all this if no one was supposed to read it?" Rick stared at the scattered pages. "Because sometimes, Morty, it's easier to spill your guts to paper than to a person. Paper doesn't look back at you, doesn't ask you to prove it." The quiet thickened again. Morty felt the pull of sleep at the edges of his mind, but he fought it, wanting to stay present. Do you ever wish you'd written stuff like this?" "For real?" Rick paused. A long pause, like he was weighing words against silence. Then he muttered almost too softly to hear, "Maybe I already have. Maybe you'll never see it." The thought clung to Morty as he leaned back against the wall. 1,000 things unsaid, folded into invisible letters. He imagined them drifting through dimensions like paper boats on rivers of time, never reaching their shores, but still carrying meaning. Rick began stacking the letters back into the box, slower than usual, as if handling something fragile. For once, he didn't toss or shove. His hands were steady, careful. When the box was closed again, Rick stood. His voice was gruff, but there was no sharpness in it. "Come on, Morty. Nothing good comes from staying in someone else's regrets too long." Morty nodded, but as he followed Rick back to the portal, he carried one image with him, a letter folded and left unsent. Its words alive even in silence. Sometimes the most important things weren't shouted or proven. Sometimes they were simply written, never delivered. And yet somehow they reached the people they were meant for. The portal sighed open, not with its usual roar, but with a soft shimmer like glass being brushed by wind. Morty stepped through first, blinking as light refracted around him in strange angles. The air was cool, almost cold, and the world was like nothing he had seen before. They stood inside a vast cavern, its walls made entirely of crystalline stone. Every surface glimmered faintly, catching echoes of their movements and scattering them into prismatic light. Above, instead of rock, there was a ceiling of translucent sky. Beyond it, the stars glowed, yet not as distant specks, but as though pressed against a window pane. "Whoa," Morty whispered. His voice bounced back at him in 100 shimmering tones, each softer than the last. "Rick, it's like we're inside a dream." Rick adjusted his coat, glancing around with narrowed eyes. "Huh, glass formations with refractive density. Probably just a weird mineral deposit." But even he couldn't disguise the way he slowed his pace, head tilted, listening to the echoes hum as if they were alive. They walked deeper into the cavern. The ground underfoot was smooth, cool, almost like walking on polished marble. Their reflections glimmered faintly in the walls, distorted, multiplied. Morty kept catching glimpses of himself, 100 Mortys in 100 slightly different ways. Some smiling, some frowning, some tired. Rick's image was everywhere too, his silhouette fractured into a kaleidoscope of possibilities. Some versions looked older, some younger. Morty wondered if Rick noticed. After a long silence, Morty murmured, "Feels like the walls are watching us," Rick snorted, though softly. "Walls don't watch, Morty, they remember. They're just bouncing back what's already here." That made Morty's stomach flutter. He thought of the letters, the words Rick never said. Maybe this place was doing the same thing, holding on to what was unspoken, sending it back like faint music. They found a hollow deeper inside, a circular chamber where the light was softer. In the center lay a smooth patch of crystal, almost like a bed carved by time itself. Morty yawned without meaning to. "Rick, I'm kinda tired." Rick glanced at him, then at the crystal bed. "Figures. Place has low-frequency resonance. Probably messes with circadian rhythms." He sighed, then lowered himself down too, stretching out with his arms behind his head. "Fine, rest a bit. But don't drool on the floor, Morty. Place is probably worth more than you." Morty chuckled weakly and lay beside him. The surface was cool at first, then strangely warm, as though it recognized the weight of their bodies and adjusted. Above them, the crystalline ceiling shimmered faintly. The stars beyond twinkled as if leaning close to listen. Slowly, Morty's eyelids grew heavier. The glow of the cave softened, fading into dream. And then dreams came. Not like usual, scattered and chaotic. These dreams felt shared, braided together. Morty found himself standing on a shore of glassy water. Rick was there too, though younger somehow, his hair darker, his face less lined. He stood with a tool in his hand but wasn't using it, only gazing out at the endless waves. Morty stepped closer. "Rick, is this me dreaming, or you?" Rick didn't turn, but his voice was quieter, almost tender. "Both. Doesn't matter whose dream it is when the walls between them thin out." Morty glanced at the horizon. The water reflected stars, each ripple scattering galaxies. Do you dream a lot?" Rick chuckled without humor. "Not the kind worth keeping." He crouched, touched the water, and the waves rippled with faint echoes, laughter, whispers, the sound of a child's voice calling Dad. Morty's breath caught. Rick stared at the ripples for a long moment. Then he stood and looked at Morty directly. His eyes, so often shielded by sarcasm, were bare, unguarded. "Dreams aren't safe, Morty. They let in things you don't want. Things you can't build walls against," Morty swallowed. "But maybe they also show you what you miss, or what you really care about." For a heartbeat, Rick said nothing. Then the dream dissolved, the water shattering into 1,000 shards of light. They were back in the cavern, but not awake. This was another layer of dream, where the walls of glass pulsed with slow, luminous rhythms, like the cavern itself was breathing. Rick sat beside Morty now, holding something small in his hand. "A sandwich," Morty blinked. "Huh? Rick, why are you—" Rick shrugged, almost sheepish. "Don't overthink it, Morty. Even in dreams you gotta eat." He handed it over. Morty bit into it, and though it was only bread and cheese again, it tasted fuller, richer, as if carrying the memory of every moment they had shared before. The silence stretched. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken care, with a bond that didn't need to be explained. Morty's eyelids grew heavy again. As the dream folded over itself, he heard Rick murmur softly, almost like he didn't want the words to escape into waking. "I do care." "Morty, More than you'll ever know. And then there was only the shimmer of stars against glass, and the hum of a cavern breathing them slowly back into sleep. The cavern of glass had left its glow on them, a faint shimmer clinging to their coats, as they stepped out into the next world. The portal closed behind them with a sigh, leaving nothing but an expanse of sand stretching endlessly in every direction. The desert was pale, almost white, like powdered stone. No dunes, no wind, no sound. Just a flat horizon that seemed to breathe heat and silence at once. The air shimmered faintly, bending light into mirages that flickered and faded before the eye could rest on them. Morty shaded his face with his hand. Rick, where are we? This doesn't look like anywhere. Rick squinted, pulling his coat tighter against the dry air. Doesn't matter. Some places aren't for doing, Morty. They're just for walking, Morty frowned. Walking where? Rick's boots crunched against the powdery surface as he took the first step. That's the trick, Morty. Sometimes you don't walk to anywhere. You just walk. Morty followed reluctantly, his sneakers sinking slightly into the pale sand. The silence was so deep that every step sounded too loud, like echoes in a cathedral. The air pressed heavy against his skin, not hot exactly, but dense, as though the whole desert was listening. For a while, neither of them spoke. Morty's legs grew tired quickly, but he didn't want to complain. He could see Rick ahead, his figure steady, shoulders hunched but purposeful. Watching Rick walk here felt different, less like a man on a mission, more like someone surrendering to the pace of the land. Finally, Morty asked, "Do you ever get tired of it? All the moving? All the portals?" Rick didn't stop. His voice drifted back, carried gently across the dry air. "More than you think, Morty. But stopping feels worse. So you keep walking. Or running. Or whatever keeps the noise out." Morty lowered his head, staring at his own shadow stretched long against the pale sand. He wanted to say something back, but words felt heavy here. Instead, he just listened to their footsteps, the soft rhythm weaving a strange kind of lullaby. Hours, or maybe minutes' time was strange here, passed. The horizon never changed, yet Morty began to notice small things, a faint glimmer under the sand, the delicate curve of a stone half buried, the way the sky shifted from pale gold to a bruised violet without a sun ever rising or setting. He whispered, almost to himself, "It's kind of beautiful, huh? Like nothing's happening, but everything's happening." Rick glanced at him, and though his face stayed impassive, Morty caught the smallest twitch of his mouth. Not a smile exactly, but close. They kept walking. Eventually, Morty's legs wobbled and he slowed until he almost stumbled. Rick stopped then, turning back. Without a word, he reached into his coat, pulled out a flask. Not for drinking, but for pouring a thin stream of water into his hand. He offered it to Morty silently. Morty drank, the liquid cool and sharp against his throat. "Thanks," he murmured. Rick just nodded and started walking again. The silence stretched once more, but it was different now, softer, like the desert had been waiting for them to find its rhythm. Their footsteps fell in unison, crunching gently. Morty's mind began to drift, lulled by the steady pace. He thought of the letters in the dusty room, of dreams under glass skies, of sandwiches shared beneath stars. Each memory felt like a step of its own, carried forward with him. At one point, Morty whispered, "Rick, what if this is the point? Just walking, just being here." Rick didn't answer right away. Then in a voice unusually low, he said, "Maybe that's all life is, Morty. One long walk. Some people rush, some people stumble, but everyone's just crossing the desert." Morty felt something loosen in his chest at those words. He let the silence hold them, let the thought echo gently inside him. Time, if it existed here, slipped past. Morty's eyes grew heavy, though he was still walking. The desert began to blur at the edges, colors bleeding softly together. It felt dreamlike, as though they were walking not on sand but through memory itself. He saw faint mirages, a younger Rick carrying a little girl on his shoulders, laughing under a sky that wasn't real. Another Rick alone hunched against winds that didn't blow here. Versions of Morty too, some running, some sitting, some reaching out a hand toward nothing. He blinked and the mirages faded, leaving only the endless pale ground. Rick walked beside him silently, his steps steady, his shadow long. Finally they stopped, not because they reached a destination, but because the desert itself seemed to sigh as if telling them they had walked enough. Rick sat down on the sand, folding his arms over his knees. Morty lowered himself beside him, breathing deeply, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the stillness around them. Neither spoke for a long time. There was nothing to say, and yet everything had already been said in the act of walking. At last Morty whispered, his voice barely louder than the desert's hush, "This wasn't so bad." Rick gave a low grunt, but his eyes were softer than usual as he gazed out at the horizon that never changed. "Told you, Morty, sometimes you don't need a destination. Sometimes the walk is the point." The desert stretched endlessly ahead, pale and infinite, holding them gently in its silence, and together they simply sat, letting the quiet world cradle them in its slow, timeless rhythm. The desert faded behind them like a dream dissolving at dawn. One moment, the endless pale expanse pressed against their skin. The next, the portal shimmered open, and they stepped into a world filled with wind. It was not a harsh wind, not the kind that stings the eyes or rattles the bones. This wind carried whispers, soft and gentle, as if the air itself remembered every sound it had ever held. The landscape stretched wide with rolling hills of grass so fine it moved like liquid. The sky was layered with pale blues and drifting silver clouds, each one trailing like a soft ribbon. Morty stopped, his sneakers sinking slightly into the grass. "It's so calm. I thought after that desert it couldn't get quieter, but this feels different. Lighter." Rick tilted his head, eyes narrowing. The wind swirled around them, carrying with it faint echoes, half-formed tones, traces of voices not fully heard. Rick didn't speak right away. He just listened, and Morty noticed the stillness in him, the kind that came only when something struck deeper than Rick wanted to admit. Then, through the whispering air, a sound rose that made Morty freeze. A laugh, high, delicate, bright, the laugh of a child. It rang for just a second before fading back into the grass and clouds. Morty blinked. Did you hear that?" Rick's jaw tightened. "Yeah, Morty, I heard it." His voice was flat, but Morty caught the subtle tremor beneath it. They began to walk slowly across the hilltops, the grass brushing their legs, the wind carrying more sounds as they moved, faint conversations, snippets of songs, long-lost voices rising for a moment before dissolving. Each one felt like memory without weight, hovering between presence and absence. The child's laugh came again, clearer this time. Rick stopped mid-step, his gaze fixed far ahead, though there was nothing there to see. Morty turned to him. "Rick, who was that?" Rick exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. "Doesn't matter, Morty, just this place playing tricks." But Morty knew better. He'd seen the way Rick's hand had twitched, almost reaching out toward the sound before pulling back. They climbed a gentle slope, and at the crest the wind surged, wrapping them in a chorus of echoes, laughter, whispers, fragments of joy and sorrow braided together. Morty closed his eyes, letting the sounds wash over him. Some of them he didn't recognize, but some felt like they belonged to him, echoes of his own voice as a child, fragments of words he thought he had forgotten, a trace of his mother calling him in for dinner. He whispered, "Rick, it's like this place remembers us, like it holds every sound we've ever made." Rick stayed quiet. His eyes were on the horizon, but Morty noticed how tight his grip was on the flask in his hand. Then the laugh came again, clear, ringing. It wasn't Morty's. It wasn't random. It was a little girl's laugh, joyful, free, the kind that fills a room with light. Rick closed his eyes, just for a second. When he opened them, they shone not with tears but with the weight of memory. Morty swallowed. "Rick, was that?" Rick finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "My daughter, when she was small." Before everything, Morty didn't know what to say. He had never heard Rick speak of her like this, not without deflection, not without a joke to cover the ache. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt necessary, like the pause between heartbeats. The two of them stood there, the wind carrying the echoes around them, until Rick finally took a step forward. Morty followed, careful not to disturb the fragile quiet. As they walked, the sounds shifted again. The laugh became distant, then returned, then faded once more. Sometimes it was so near Morty thought he could see a figure darting between the tall grass. Other times it was only a trace, like a memory dissolving on the tongue. Rick's voice broke the silence. You know, Morty, memory's a cruel thing. It doesn't stay sharp. It frays at the edges. You forget the words, but you remember the laugh. You forget the face, but you remember the way it felt when they looked at you. The echoes stick, even when everything else fades. Morty nodded slowly, his chest tight. He wanted to tell Rick it was okay, that he understood, but he also knew Rick didn't want comfort. He wanted honesty. So Morty just said softly, I'm glad you still hear it, Rick. That means it's not gone. Not really. Rick glanced at him, and though he said nothing, there was a flicker in his eyes that Morty had never seen before. Gratitude, fragile and fleeting, but real. They walked on until the hills began to dip into a shallow valley. The grass bent in waves as the wind moved, and the echoes softened as if the land itself was exhaling. The laugh came one last time, gentle like a farewell, and then it was gone, leaving only the quiet hum of the wind. Rick stood still for a moment, then lowered himself to sit in the grass. Morty sat beside him, the two of them watching the clouds drift slowly across the pale sky. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The echo lingered not in the air now, but inside them, settled softly where words could never fully reach. After a long time, Morty whispered, Do you think we'll always hear them in places like this? Rick didn't answer right away. Then quietly he said, If we're lucky, Morty, if we're lucky. The wind sighed again, carrying no laughter this time, only stillness, only peace, and for once, that was enough. The grasslands gave way slowly as if reluctant to let go. One step at a time, the hills dipped lower, and the whispers of laughter and memory faded behind Rick and Morty. The air grew cooler, denser, and a faint glow shimmered ahead, a pale green light rising from the ground as though the earth itself was breathing softly. Morty tugged at Rick's sleeve. Do you see that? Rick grunted, his eyes narrowing. Yeah, some kind of luminescence, probably unstable radiation, or maybe just something else. But the tone of his voice told Morty it wasn't just science. There was something unexplainable in the way the light pulsed, slow, calm, alive. They descended into a shallow valley, and there it was, a river, wide and winding, its surface glowing with a soft green radiance. It wasn't like water exactly. It flowed too slowly, too deliberately, as though it carried thought instead of liquid. Every ripple shimmered, and every shimmer reflected not their faces, but something deeper. Morty leaned forward over the bank. It's beautiful, like, it's not showing me. It's showing. He trailed off, lost in the shifting shapes on the surface. His reflection twisted, not into another version of himself, but into a feeling, an ache of longing, a memory of wanting to be seen. Rick crouched down too, his shadow falling into the water. His reflection didn't show his face. Instead, it bloomed with sorrow, faint, fragile, but undeniable. A loneliness Morty had always sensed in him, but had never seen so nakedly displayed. For a long while, neither spoke. The river seemed to hum quietly, its current carrying not sound but feeling. Morty found himself whispering, It's like it knows what's inside us. Rick nodded slowly. Feelings don't lie the way words do. You can't argue with what this thing's showing you. You can try, but... His voice trailed off. Morty sat down by the river's edge, hugging his knees to his chest. He watched the green ripples bend and fold, revealing fragments of his own inner self, fear, hope, kindness, woven together like threads of light. I didn't know water could understand us. Rick's gaze stayed on the glowing surface. His reflection flickered again, shifting into grief, then into a sharp pang of guilt, then softening into something gentler. This isn't water, Morty, it's memory. Or maybe it's empathy. Some kind of mirror for the heart. Morty was quiet for a moment, then asked, What do you see, Rick? Rick didn't answer immediately. He watched as the river revealed him, the weight he carried, the regrets stitched into his silence, the fragile kindnesses he tried to hide. Finally he said softly, I see what I try not to. Morty didn't push further. Instead, he reached down and let his hand hover just above the surface. The river pulsed faintly as if greeting him. For a second his reflection glowed with warmth. Love, trust, the bond he felt for Rick even when he didn't understand him. Rick noticed. He didn't say anything, but he felt it. Morty's quiet, unwavering presence. The boy didn't need answers, didn't need explanations. Just being there was enough. They followed the riverbank for a while, the light guiding their steps. The water whispered against the rocks, not with words but with emotions. Sometimes the glow was sharp, almost painful, reflecting anger and sorrow. Other times it softened, filling the valley with a calm so deep it felt like sleep. At one bend, the current slowed almost to stillness. Rick knelt, staring at the green light. For a heartbeat, Morty thought he saw Rick's daughter's laugh ripple across the surface, a memory carried over from the last world. Rick blinked and it was gone. He muttered more to himself than to Morty, "Feelings don't disappear. They just change shape. Sometimes they flow like this. Sometimes they drown you. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they hold you up." Morty listened in silence, the weight of Rick's words settling deep. When they finally stopped to rest, Morty lay back in the soft grass beside the river. The glow reflected against the clouds above, turning the sky into a pale green dome. He closed his eyes, listening to the hum of the water, and for the first time in a long time he felt entirely safe. Rick stayed seated, staring at the current. The reflection shifted again, sorrow, guilt, longing, but then something else appeared. For the briefest moment, the river showed him Morty's reflection, glowing with trust, steady and patient. Rick exhaled, a sound half between a sigh and a laugh. "Stupid river," he muttered. But he didn't look away. The two of them stayed there until the glow dimmed with dawn. When they finally rose to leave, the river continued flowing behind them, carrying their unspoken truths into its endless current. As they stepped back toward the portal, the sound of the water lingered, like a lullaby that had no end. The glow of the river still lingered behind their eyes when they stepped through the portal. For a moment, Morty thought the new world was empty, only vast darkness like a sky without stars. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw them, pinpricks of light scattered across the ground, glowing faintly, as though the earth itself had blossomed with constellations. Rick raised an eyebrow, his usual smirk softened by curiosity. "Well, this is new. A whole field full of stars." Morty blinked, stunned. "Wait, they're not in the sky. They're flowers?" He knelt down, reaching out toward one of the luminous shapes. What looked like a small, delicate bloom pulsed faintly, its petals translucent, its glow breathing in and out like a quiet heartbeat. The ground stretched endlessly, carpeted with thousands of them, an entire garden of stars. Rick crouched beside him, plucking a small one gently from the earth. Instead of wilting, it hovered in his palm, glowing brighter, then dimmer, as if it were alive. He stared at it for a long while, the green of the river still echoing in his mind before speaking. Not flowers, memories, trapped light. Whole lifetimes, maybe. Morty touched one carefully. It flickered, and for a second, he saw himself at 6 years old, running through his backyard, chasing fireflies. The image faded almost as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the gentle pulse of light in the bloom. "Whoa, Rick, did you see that?" Rick's star pulsed differently, heavier somehow, its glow muted. He didn't tell Morty what he'd seen, but it lingered behind his eyes. His daughter again, laughing in the sun, her small hands holding a toy he'd built for her. A memory too vivid to ignore, too painful to hold for long. He closed his fist gently, the light seeping between his fingers, before setting it back onto the soil. They began to walk, weaving carefully between the glowing blossoms. Each step seemed to awaken more light, the ground shimmering beneath them, as though the field were alive, welcoming their presence. Morty whispered, "It's like walking through the sky, Rick, like we're inside a dream," Rick grunted. But he didn't disagree. As they wandered deeper, Morty noticed how Rick slowed down, no longer rushing to the next portal, no longer eager to explain everything away with science. His gaze lingered on the lights, softening as if each glow reminded him of something he couldn't quite say aloud. They stopped on a small hill in the middle of the field. The flowers around them glowed brighter, forming a gentle circle of light. Rick lowered himself to the ground with a sigh, pulling his knees up while Morty sat cross-legged beside him. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the stars, breathing softly like lullabies drifting in the night. Finally, Morty broke the silence. "Rick, do you think these stars belong to people, like maybe everyone leaves behind something that shines like this?" Rick rubbed at his face, staring at the light. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just another weird planet. Either way, Doesn't really matter, does it? But Morty caught the quiet weight in Rick's voice. He leaned back into the grass, eyes half closed. I think it matters, I think. If we leave something behind, even if it's just a little glow like this, it means we weren't forgotten. Rick didn't answer right away. He plucked another starflower, watching it flicker between his fingers. This one didn't show his daughter. Instead, it revealed Morty, younger, scared, clinging to him in some dangerous moment Rick barely remembered. The memory wasn't of himself. It was of how Morty had looked at him, trusting, believing. His chest tightened, though his face remained unreadable. Morty yawned softly beside him, his voice slurring with sleep. I wish I could take one with me, just to remember. Rick smirked faintly, but his eyes stayed on the glowing bloom. Morty, you don't need one. You're already carrying enough stars inside you. Morty smiled drowsily, his eyes closing. That's cheesy, Rick. Yeah, Rick muttered. Don't get used to it. The boy drifted into sleep, the glow of the stars reflecting softly against his face. Rick stayed awake, watching him for a while, the silence settling around them like a blanket. He leaned back onto the grass, the blooms pulsing gently beneath his shoulders. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel the need to move. He just let himself be. Above them, the sky remained dark, but it didn't matter. The stars were here, blooming at their feet, carrying fragments of lives too vast to comprehend. Rick closed his eyes at last, the light flickering behind his eyelids. For a moment he imagined what his own glow might look like when he was gone, whether it would be sharp and fractured, or soft and steady. Whether Morty might find it one day, wandering some field like this, and smile. The thought stayed with him as he drifted, not into sleep exactly, but into something close, something restful. The field breathed around them, an endless garden of stars, and in that quiet, Rick allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, even he had left behind a little light. The garden of stars lingered behind them like a dream they couldn't fully leave. Even as the portal closed, Morty carried the soft glow inside him, and Rick, though he would never admit it, walked more slowly than usual, as though part of him wanted to stay. The new world they entered was quiet. Not the silence of emptiness, but the hushed stillness of a room where someone is about to speak. The air was cool, the ground soft beneath their feet, covered in pale moss that seemed to drink in the dim light. Above, the sky stretched wide with drifting clouds, their edges glowing faintly as if brushed with silver. Morty tugged at his sleeve. Rick, can I ask you something? Rick sighed, not looking at him. You're already asking, Morty. Spit it out. Morty hesitated. It wasn't like other times, when he questioned Rick with frustration or fear. This time his voice was softer, almost shy. All these places we've seen, the stars, the river, the voices in the wind. What do you think it all means? Rick stopped walking. He didn't turn around. For a long moment, he just stood there, his shoulders rising and falling with a quiet breath. Then he crouched down, picking up a small stone from the moss and rolling it between his fingers. What it means, Morty, he said at last, his voice low, is that people are always trying to make sense of things that don't make sense. We see light and think it's memory. We hear laughter and think it's ghosts. But maybe it's just the universe being the universe. Morty stepped closer, frowning. Yeah, but doesn't that make it even stranger? Like, if it's not memory or ghosts, then why does it feel like it is? Why does it feel like it's talking to us? Rick finally looked at him, his expression unreadable. Because, Morty, you want it to. You want everything to mean something. You want a pattern, a story, some grand connection tying it all together. But maybe, he flicked the stone away, maybe it's all random. And we're just desperate enough to pretend it's not. Morty swallowed. But do you believe that? Rick's mouth opened, then closed again. He glanced at the moss beneath his boots, then back at Morty. His eyes softened, though his words stayed rough. Doesn't matter what I believe. What matters is what you feel when you look at it. If you see meaning, then that's your meaning. If you see nothing, then that's your nothing. Morty sat down on the moss, hugging his knees. The clouds above drifted slowly, almost like they were listening. I don't know, Rick. I think it means something. Even if it's just that we're here together. That we're seeing it. Rick didn't answer. He sat down too, leaning back on his hands, staring at the sky. The silence stretched between them. Not empty, but full, like the pause after a question that doesn't need an answer. After a while, Morty spoke again. Do you ever regret stuff, Rick? Like, not what you did, but what you didn't do? Things you never said. Rick exhaled through his nose, the faintest trace of a laugh escaping him. Morty, my whole life is one long list of things I didn't do. But regrets are useless. You can't go back. You can only sit here in weird moss with your annoying grandson and pretend you're not thinking about it. Morty smiled faintly, resting his chin on his knees. I think, even if you can't go back, it still matters, like, maybe regrets are just proof that you cared, that you wanted something to be different. Rick tilted his head, studying him for a long moment. Then he muttered, You're getting too smart for your own good, Morty. But his tone wasn't sharp. It was almost proud. The two of them sat together in the quiet world, the moss glowing faintly beneath them, the clouds shifting above like a slow river of light. Morty closed his eyes, his voice barely more than a whisper. I just don't want it all to be random, Rick. I don't want to think none of it matters. I want to believe. It means something. Rick didn't respond right away. His gaze was fixed on the drifting clouds, but his mind was elsewhere, on a laugh carried by the wind, on a starflower pulsing in his hand, on the boy sitting beside him, who kept asking the questions he didn't want to answer. Finally, Rick let out a long breath. Maybe it means something because you're here to ask the question, Morty. Maybe that's all it ever was. Morty looked up at him, his eyes wide. You really think so? Rick didn't smile, but his expression softened just enough. I think it's enough. They sat together until the clouds thinned and the sky deepened into twilight. No grand revelation, no thunderous truth, just two figures on the moss, sharing the quiet. And sometimes, Rick thought, that was meaning enough. The air shimmered faintly when Rick opened the next portal, but unlike the others, this one did not roar or ripple with urgency. It was quiet, almost still. The oval of light hummed gently as though it were breathing. Morty stood beside him, arms folded across his chest. Rick, this one feels different, like it doesn't want us to go through. Rick's hand hovered near the device, his expression unreadable. Portals don't want anything, Morty, they just exist, but yeah. His voice dipped low. This one's different. The green glow was softer than usual, almost like candlelight spilling onto the moss at their feet. Rick stared at it for a long time, then exhaled, his shoulders heavy. You ready? Morty hesitated. I guess, but what's on the other side? Rick didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, and Morty followed. The world they entered was neither vast nor strange. No glowing rivers, no starflowers, no crystalline caves. Just a field of tall golden grass, swaying gently in the wind. The sky above was pale blue, the sun low on the horizon, painting everything in soft amber. It looked ordinary, almost too ordinary compared to everything they had seen before. Morty blinked, his voice uncertain. Rick, is this it? Rick's gaze swept over the field. His jaw clenched, but there was no smirk, no sarcasm, only silence. He lowered himself into the grass, sitting with his legs stretched out, the way someone might rest at the end of a long walk. Morty slowly sat beside him, running his hands along the blades of grass. The wind carried no echoes, no memories, only the simple sound of rustling. For a long while they said nothing. Finally, Morty spoke. Why does it feel like this is the last one? Rick didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the sun dipped lower. Because sometimes, Morty, you just know, the road runs out, the portals stop opening. The universe says that's enough. Morty's chest tightened. He pulled his knees up to his chest. But I don't want it to be over. Rick let out a slow breath. Nothing really ends, Morty. Not the way you think. Things change shape. They loop back. They echo. But the form you're in, the journey you're on. Yeah, that ends, Morty frowned. So what happens next? Rick shrugged lightly. You carry it. In here. He tapped his chest with two fingers, almost absently. You remember the river, the stars, the laugh. You don't need portals to keep them. The boy was quiet for a moment, then whispered, And what about us? Rick finally turned, his eyes softer than Morty had ever seen them. We're already carried, Morty, whether we like it or not. The wind rose, bending the grass in long, flowing waves. Morty lay back, staring at the sky, his voice small. I thought the last one would be bigger, More important. Rick leaned back too, folding his arms behind his head. That's the trick, Morty. Endings don't come with fireworks. They come like this, quiet, ordinary, just sitting in a field with someone you didn't expect to matter this much. Morty turned his head, studying Rick's profile. The lines in his face looked deeper in the golden light, but softer too. Less sharp. Less armored. For once, Rick wasn't hiding behind science or cynicism. He was just here. The silence stretched on, warm and steady. Morty felt his eyes grow heavy, the weight of the journey settling into his bones. Rick, still staring at the horizon, whispered almost to himself, "This isn't the last portal, Morty. It's just the last one we need." Morty let those words sink in. He didn't fully understand them, but somehow they made sense. He closed his eyes, listening to the rustling grass, the low hum of the wind, the steady presence of Rick beside him. The portal device lay in the grass a few feet away, its light dim, as if it too were resting. For the first time, Rick didn't reach for it. He didn't need to. The sun dipped lower, painting the field in deeper gold. Morty's breathing slowed, his body relaxing into the earth. Rick glanced at him once, then leaned back fully, letting the grass cradle him. The last portal shimmered faintly behind them, then closed with a soft sigh. No urgency. No ending, just presence. Just this. And for both of them, that was enough. The field of golden grass swayed gently, its rhythm slow and forgiving. The portal behind them was gone now, folded back into the fabric of worlds that no longer asked for their footsteps. Only the open sky remained, and the soft whisper of the earth breathing beneath them. Rick sat with his knees bent, one arm resting lazily over them, the other hand absently tracing circles into the soil. Morty leaned closer, his head almost tipping against Rick's shoulder before he caught himself. Rick noticed. He always noticed, but he didn't move away. He only shifted slightly, leaving a space just wide enough, just still enough for Morty to rest if he chose. Morty hesitated, then slowly leaned in. His head came to rest against Rick's shoulder, tentative at first, then steady. The warmth surprised him, not the physical warmth, but the quiet assurance of being allowed to stay there. Neither of them spoke. Above them, the sky carried slow-moving clouds, drifting like pale ships across an endless ocean. They had no destination, no purpose beyond existing, and in that, Morty thought, they seemed to mirror this moment, just floating, just being. Rick tilted his head back, exhaling smoke from a cigarette he hadn't really needed but lit anyway. The smoke curled upward, caught in the amber light of the fading sun. Morty's eyes half closed. "You know, Rick, we don't have to say anything right now." Rick gave a small grunt of agreement. "Finally, Morty, you figured it out." His voice was soft, though, the usual bite missing. The words were half teasing, half grateful. Silence stretched again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything unsaid, everything carried across all the worlds and years, the laughter. The mistakes, the quiet gestures, the wounds they never spoke about but both knew were there. The clouds shifted, parting just enough to reveal the first faint stars. Morty lifted his head, pointing weakly. "Look, they're showing up." Rick followed his gaze, his expression unreadable. The stars reflected faintly in his eyes, but for once he didn't try to explain them, didn't reduce them to science or equations. He let them be what they were, points of wonder in a darkening sky. Morty's voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you ever think they're watching us? Like stars remember things?" Rick didn't laugh. He didn't correct him. Instead, he answered quietly, "Maybe, Morty. Maybe they remember better than we do." The boy shifted closer, the grass rustling around them. He thought of the rivers they had crossed, the glowing lanterns they had seen, the voices that had lingered like echoes in the air. He thought of the little kindnesses Rick never admitted to, but always carried out when no one else was looking. "Rick?" "Yeah?" "Thanks, sir." Rick didn't ask what for. He didn't need to. He simply nodded once, the gesture small but grounding, and placed his free hand on the grass close enough that Morty could feel the intent behind it. The wind softened, carrying the smell of earth and distant rain. Morty's eyelids grew heavier, his body sinking deeper into rest. Rick stayed still, listening to the boy's breathing, steady and unhurried. Time seemed to fold in on itself. Seconds stretched like hours. Hours shrank into moments. Neither of them tried to capture it. They just let it pass, as natural as the drifting clouds above. Rick glanced at Morty again. The boy was nearly asleep now, head against his shoulder, lips parted slightly. For all his doubts, all his questions, all his endless tugging against the chaos Rick brought into his life, Morty was still here, still choosing to stay, and Rick, who had opened 1,000 portals, crossed 1,000 worlds, found himself quietly grateful that at least one person had chosen to rest beside him at the end of it. The first star blinked brighter, then another and another, until the whole sky began to open like a slow, luminous curtain. Rick exhaled softly. "Guess it's just us now, huh, Morty?" Morty, half asleep, murmured something that sounded like agreement, and so they sat, not as genius and sidekick, not as wanderers or fugitives of infinite dimensions, just as two beings who, for one fleeting evening, had nothing left to prove, nowhere else to go. The night grew deeper. The silence did not demand words. It simply held them. Rick leaned back slightly, letting the weight of the day slip from his shoulders. Morty's head stayed against him, steady in its quiet trust. The sky darkened fully, the stars shimmering like tiny lanterns scattered through eternity. And beneath them, in the soft hush of golden fields, Rick and Morty let the universe move without them, finding for once enough in the simple act of staying still together. The night had deepened into its quietest hour. The grass around them whispered only when the wind remembered to pass by, and even then, the sound was gentler than before, like a secret being spoken too softly to ever disturb the world. Rick sat alone now, Morty asleep at his side, curled slightly into the earth as though it were a cradle. The boy's breathing was steady, carrying the rhythm of someone who had finally, if only for a moment, found rest. Rick looked down at him, the faint lines of exhaustion on his young face, and something softened in the old man's chest. He leaned back, his gaze lifting to the wide expanse above. The stars were brighter now, 100, 1,000, 1,000,000 glimmers stitched into the infinite black. They didn't roar, they didn't demand. They simply existed, steady, constant, eternal. Rick's lips twitched into the ghost of a smile. He remembered portals. He remembered machines and equations, all those endless attempts to bend the universe to his will. But tonight, beneath this sky, he remembered something else. Quieter victories, smaller choices. The sandwiches made on lonely nights. The pauses he allowed himself to take when Morty asked him to look. The fragments of memory he had once tried to drown, but now let drift freely, as though they belonged to the stars instead of him. Rick took a slow breath, and it almost felt like peace. He whispered, though no one had asked him to, "You don't have to fix it all." "Rick, not tonight." The words hung in the air, absorbed by the grass, by the clouds, by the boy beside him who would never know they had been spoken. A shooting star trailed faintly across the horizon. Rick's eyes followed it, not with scientific curiosity, but with something simpler, like wonder remembered after being lost for too long. For a moment, the night felt like an echo of childhood. The nights when he had once stared at skies like this, unburdened by genius or failure, when the stars had been enough on their own. Morty stirred slightly in his sleep, his head pressing closer against Rick's arm. Rick froze, then relaxed. He let him stay there. He didn't shift away. The clouds moved slowly, drifting like pages turning in a book too big for anyone to finish. Rick thought of all the universes he had crossed, all the selves he had seen, all the choices stacked endlessly atop one another. And yet here, in this small field under this quiet sky, it felt as though he had finally reached the last page that mattered. Morty's breathing steadied again, and Rick's eyes closed for just a moment. He let the hum of silence wash over him, the soft pull of gravity, the weight of time slipping by unnoticed. And when he opened them, the stars still burned. Patient, unshaken, unbroken. Rick lifted his hand, reaching toward them as though he could stretch just a little farther and touch the light itself. His fingers wavered, then fell back into the grass. He let out a breath that trembled at first, then steadied, a release that felt like something more than just air leaving his lungs. "And with that," he murmured, voice softer than the night itself, he stretched into the stars. The words weren't meant for anyone, yet the universe seemed to hold them, to fold them gently into itself. Rick leaned his head back, the lines of weariness around his eyes illuminated by faint starlight. Morty shifted again, but did not wake. Together in silence they remained, two figures in a world that had finally asked nothing of them. The night deepened still further. The world grew hushed like a lullaby fading into dream. Rick allowed his own eyes to close, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in something gentler, something closer to rest. And somewhere beyond the field, beyond the stars, beyond the portals that no longer needed to open, the universe moved on. It carried their silence like a secret it promised never to break. The story had no sharp ending, no loud conclusion. Only this quiet, this companionship, this presence beneath a sky that had always been watching. Rick exhaled once more, and the sound folded into the breeze, into the hum of the night. And then, nothing but peace. And with that he stretched into the stars. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.